Rain slid down the dark evening sky in gentle streaks, tapping softly against the pavement as if the city itself were breathing in slow, careful rhythm. Streetlights glimmered against the wet road, each reflection stretching across the asphalt like soft gold ribbons. In the middle of that quiet street stood a man who did not belong to the night's ordinary flow of life. Calder Ashbourne remained still beneath the rain, his coat slowly darkening as water soaked into the fabric. In his hands, he held a small bouquet of white lilies wrapped in thin paper. The petals were delicate, already beginning to bend under the damp air. He had chosen them because they reminded him of her, simple, gentle, and unassuming. He did not care that the rain was flattening them. He did not care that passers-by glanced at him with brief curiosity. Nothing around him mattered except the door he was staring at. This was not the kind of place that usually welcomed someone like Calder. The building before him was narrow and quiet, with chipped paint and narrow windows that glowed faintly from the light inside. It sat above a bakery that smelled of warm bread and sugar, even through the rain. Most people walked past it without a second glance. But for Calder, it had become the most important place in the world. His fingers tightened slightly around the flower stems. His breath rose and fell slowly, controlled, but heavy with something deeper than exhaustion. This was not the weight of business or numbers or decisions that moved entire companies. This was the weight of hope, the fragile, trembling hope that maybe, just maybe, she would still be there. Rain slid down his hair and traced along his jaw, but he made no move to wipe it away. He stood as though the ground itself had claimed him. The noise of the city moved around him, distant engines, soft footsteps, the faint hum of a world that did not pause for anyone's heartbreak. Yet Calder felt as though time itself had narrowed to a single moment. He was waiting for a door to open, not for applause, not for recognition, not for fortune, just for her. The lilies trembled slightly as a breeze passed through the street. Calder lowered his gaze to them for a brief moment, noticing how one petal had torn. Even something beautiful could be damaged by weather. The thought cut deeper than he expected. People who knew him would never recognize this version of Calder Ashbourne. The global figure who stood at podiums and signed billion-dollar agreements was nowhere to be found here. In his place stood a man who felt strangely small beneath the rain, holding flowers like a nervous stranger. He lifted his eyes again toward the apartment above the bakery. Every second stretched longer than the last. His mind replayed a single image over and over, a woman's face lit softly by rain, eyes filled with quiet courage, hands steady as she saved his life. That memory was the only thing that kept him rooted there, even as doubt whispered that maybe she was already gone. But Calder refused to move. Not yet. Because somewhere behind that door, the woman who had changed everything might still be there, and he was not ready to give up on the chance to see her again. Rain drifted steadily from the night sky, soft yet persistent, coating the city in a gentle shimmer. Every street, every rooftop, and every moving car reflected the glow of thousands of lights, turning the wide avenues into flowing rivers of gold and white. From above, the city looked alive, not with chaos, but with quiet motion, as if everything were moving to a hidden rhythm only the night could hear. Drops tapped against windows and sidewalks alike, filling the air with a steady whisper that blended with distant traffic and muffled footsteps. The buildings, tall and unyielding, stood beneath the falling rain like silent witnesses to countless untold stories unfolding inside their walls. In this weather, even the busiest places felt softer, wrapped in a veil that slowed the world just enough to make every moment feel heavier. Somewhere among those glowing streets, countless lives carried on without knowing that a single fragile moment was about to change one man's fate forever. The rain did not know whose life it would touch, yet it fell anyway, settling gently on everything, quietly setting the stage for a night that would never be forgotten. Calder sat alone in the back seat of his sleek black vehicle as it glided slowly through the rain-soaked streets. The interior was quiet and refined, wrapped in soft leather and faintly lit by subtle dashboard lights that reflected off the polished surfaces. Outside, the city moved past the tinted windows in blurred streaks of silver and gold. But inside, everything felt still, almost insulated from the world beyond the glass. His jacket was neatly buttoned, and his posture remained composed, the way years of responsibility had trained him to be. To anyone watching from the outside, he looked like a man in control of everything around him. Yet beneath that calm surface, something felt wrong, though he could not yet explain it. His chest carried a faint pressure, not painful, just unfamiliar, like a warning whispered by his own body. The driver sat ahead, focused on the road, unaware that the quiet behind him hid the beginning of a crisis. Calder gazed forward, lost in thought, never suspecting that the ride he had taken 1,000 times before was about to become the most frightening of his life. At first, Calder thought it was nothing more than a dry feeling in his throat. He swallowed once, then again, expecting the sensation to pass as easily as it had come. Instead, the tightness grew, spreading like a slow grip from the base of his neck upward. Each breath felt thinner than the last, as though the air around him had suddenly become harder to pull in. He shifted in his seat, straightening his back, trying to ignore the uneasy pressure building inside his chest. His fingers brushed against his collar, loosening it slightly, hoping that would ease whatever strange discomfort was settling over him. It didn't. The more he tried to draw in a steady breath, the more it felt like something was gently, steadily pressing inward. A quiet alarm stirred in his mind. Calder had faced many difficult moments in his life, but none like this. This was not a problem he could solve with money or influence. This was his own body turning against him, closing off the very thing he needed to stay alive, and he had no idea how to stop it. The car slowed until it was barely moving, hemmed in by rows of other vehicles stretching endlessly ahead. Red lights glowed through the rain, forming a long, unbroken line that refused to move. The driver glanced at the dashboard clock, then back at the road, his jaw tightening as he realized just how firmly they were stuck. He tapped his fingers against the steering wheel, trying to find a way out of the standstill. A quick look in the mirrors told him what he already feared. Cars packed tightly behind them, leaving no space to turn or escape. The rain only made it worse, turning the street into a slick path that demanded careful, slow movement from every driver. When he glanced back toward Calder, he noticed the tension in his passenger's posture. Something wasn't right. A flicker of worry crossed his face, and his breathing quickened. He had been trained to handle emergencies, yet this was different. They weren't just delayed, they were trapped, and time suddenly felt far more precious than it had just moments ago. Calder's breathing became uneven, each inhale shorter than the last. He leaned forward slightly, pressing a hand against his chest as if that might somehow open the space inside him. His lungs worked harder, yet the air they drew in felt weak, barely enough to ease the growing tightness in his throat. A quiet sound escaped him, something between a cough and a gasp. He tried to speak, to call out to the driver, but the words refused to form. All that came was a strained rush of breath that did nothing to help. His vision blurred at the edges, the lights outside the window stretching into faint streaks as his body struggled to keep itself steady. Panic crept in, not wild or loud, but cold and heavy. Calder had never felt so helpless. He was used to controlling every situation, yet here he was, trapped in a moving box, fighting for something as simple as air. Every second felt longer, every breath more difficult, and he knew deep down that something was terribly wrong. Arya stepped out into the rain with a tired yet steady stride, her small bag slung over one shoulder as she began the familiar walk home from the clinic. The long hours had left her muscles aching, but there was a quiet sense of purpose that followed her wherever she went. Helping people, even in small ways, had become more than just her job. It was the rhythm of her life. Raindrops tapped against her jacket as she moved along the sidewalk, her thoughts drifting between the patients she had treated and the warm meal she hoped to have waiting for her. The city glowed softly around her, but she barely noticed it. Her focus remained inward, replaying conversations and medical notes, always searching for ways she could do better tomorrow. Despite her exhaustion, her eyes remained alert, trained by years of care and responsibility. She never truly stopped paying attention to the world around her, because she knew that emergencies did not wait for convenient moments. As Arya walked past a line of slowly moving vehicles, something unusual caught her attention. One car, darker and more polished than the others, had come to a near stop, Yet its driver was leaning back toward the rear seat in a way that did not match the flow of traffic. Most drivers stared ahead, focused on the road, but this one looked tense, almost alarmed. Arya slowed her steps without fully realizing why. A quiet sense of concern stirred inside her, the kind that came from years of working in medicine. Her eyes scanned the vehicle through the rain-streaked window, searching for signs that something was wrong. The faint outline of a man in the back seat shifted awkwardly, his movements sharp and unsteady. She paused at the edge of the sidewalk, her heart beating just a little faster. It was nothing obvious yet, nothing that demanded action, but instinct told her to look closer. In moments like this, those instincts had never failed her before, and she wasn't about to ignore them now. Arya stepped closer to the side of the car, peering through the glass as rain traced thin lines across the window. What she saw made her breath catch. The man in the back seat was no longer just shifting uncomfortably. His body was tense, his shoulders drawn inward and one hand pressed tightly against his throat. His mouth opened and closed as though he were trying to pull in air that refused to come. His eyes, wide with fear, searched the space around him, not for help yet, but in disbelief that his own body was betraying him so suddenly. The faint glow of the car's interior light revealed the strain in his face, the unnatural tightness around his jaw. Arya did not need a medical chart or a monitor to understand what was happening. Years of experience told her everything she needed to know in that single glance. This was not discomfort. This was danger. If no one acted, and acted quickly, the man before her could lose his life right there in the middle of traffic. Without hesitation, Arya raised her hand and struck the window of the car with firm, urgent taps. The sound cut through the steady rain, sharp enough to draw the driver's attention at once. He turned, startled, his eyes widening as he noticed her standing there, soaked yet focused. She leaned closer to the glass, pointing toward the back seat, her lips moving quickly as she tried to communicate the danger even before the door was opened. Her expression left no room for confusion. This was not a stranger asking for directions. This was someone demanding that a life be taken seriously. The driver hesitated for only a heartbeat, then reached for the control that released the locks. Arya knocked again, harder this time, her palms stinging slightly from the impact. Every second felt precious. A closed window could be the thin line between help arriving in time and help arriving too late. The door swung open, and Arya stepped forward without waiting for permission. Rain clung to her hair and jacket, but her focus was fixed entirely on the man in the back seat. She spoke quickly and clearly, her voice steady, giving instructions to the driver as though they had known each other for years. "Stay calm," she said, her tone firm yet reassuring. "We need space. Keep him upright." Her hands moved with practiced precision as she adjusted Calder's position, making sure his body was aligned to help his breathing as much as possible. The driver, shaken but willing, followed her words without question. In that moment, Arya was not just a passerby. She was the one in charge, the person everyone looked to for direction. Fear still lingered in the air, but her presence brought order to the chaos. Even Calder, though barely able to focus, felt the shift. Someone was there. Someone knew what to do. Arya reached into her bag with quick, certain movements, her fingers closing around a small, familiar object. She drew it out and held it up for just a moment, checking it with a glance before bringing it closer to Calder. It was a compact injector, something she carried everywhere for situations just like this. The rain continued to fall around them, but her hands did not shake. Years of training and countless hours in the clinic had prepared her for moments where hesitation could cost a life. She explained what she was doing in calm, simple words, even though Calder could barely process them. The driver watched, wide-eyed, as she removed the safety cap. The device looked ordinary, almost harmless, yet Arya knew it carried the power to give Calder a fighting chance. In a night filled with fear and uncertainty, this small tool became the most important thing in the world. With careful precision, Arya administered the injection, pressing it gently but firmly into Calder's arm. For a brief moment, nothing seemed to change. His breathing remained strained, his body still locked in a silent struggle. Arya kept her eyes on him, watching for the smallest sign of relief, her own breath held as though she was sharing his fight. Then, slowly, a shift began. The tightness in his face eased just a fraction. His chest rose a little higher than before, drawing in more air than it had moments earlier. Another breath followed, steadier this time, and then another. The panic that had filled his eyes began to soften, replaced by a fragile awareness that he was no longer slipping away. The driver let out a shaky breath of relief, but Arya stayed focused, monitoring every detail. This was not the end of the danger, but it was the turning point. Calder was still here. His life, hanging by a thin thread just moments ago, had been pulled back into his body by her quick and fearless action. Calder's vision was still hazy, but as his breathing grew steadier, his eyes slowly found Arya's face. Rain clung to her lashes, and a few damp strands of hair framed her focused expression. In that brief moment, the noise of the street and the rush of everything around them seemed to fade, leaving only the two of them in a quiet space that felt strangely separate from the rest of the world. He wanted to speak, to thank her, to ask her name, but his body was too weak to obey. All he could do was look at her, memorizing the calm strength in her eyes. She met his gaze without fear, offering a soft, reassuring nod that told him he was going to be all right. As the weight of exhaustion finally pulled him under, that single image stayed with him. Not the car, not the rain. Just her face, filled with concern and resolve, becoming the last thing he saw before darkness gently claimed him. When Calder opened his eyes, the first thing he noticed was the soft hum of medical equipment and the steady rhythm of a heart monitor nearby. The air was clean and cool, carrying the faint scent of antiseptic. He lay in a hospital bed, surrounded by white walls and careful order, a sharp contrast to the rain-soaked street he barely remembered. A nurse stood nearby, checking his vitals with quiet efficiency. When she noticed his eyes open, she offered a gentle smile and spoke in a calm, reassuring tone. Calder tried to move, but his body felt heavy, as though it was still recovering from a long, exhausting battle. Fragments of the night returned to him in pieces, the tightness in his throat, the fear, and then her face. He searched the room instinctively, hoping to see the woman who had been there when he needed someone most. But the space beside his bed was empty, and a strange ache settled in his chest as he realized she was gone. Two doctors stood at the foot of Calder's bed, reviewing his chart with careful attention. One of them looked up and spoke in a clear, measured voice, explaining what had happened while he was unconscious. They told him about the severe reaction that had nearly taken his life and how close he had come to losing the fight before help arrived. Calder listened, still weak, his mind clinging to every word. When he asked who had helped him, the answer came with a note of quiet admiration. A woman had stepped in during the emergency, administered the right medication, and stayed just long enough to be sure he was stable before medical staff took over. When Calder asked for her name, the doctors exchanged a brief glance. She hadn't given one. No contact information, no request for thanks. She had simply walked away after doing what she needed to do. That answer left Calder more unsettled than anything else. In a world where everyone wanted something from him, the woman who had saved his life had asked for nothing at all, and vanished without a trace. Calder Ashbourne was not a man most people ever met, yet almost everyone lived in a world shaped by his ideas. He was known not just for what he owned, but for what he built. From a young age, his mind had always moved faster than the people around him, seeing patterns, solving problems, and finding better ways to make things work. That brilliance carried him from modest beginnings into the highest circles of innovation and leadership. Despite his public image as a confident visionary, Calder was, at heart, deeply private. He avoided unnecessary attention, preferring quiet rooms and thoughtful conversation over loud gatherings. The cameras that followed him never captured the full story of who he was. They saw the success, the sharp suits, the composed speeches. They never saw the man who now lay in a hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the memory of a stranger whose face he could not forget. Calder's companies formed a vast network of technology that quietly powered cities, businesses, and everyday life. From software that managed entire transportation systems to platforms that connected millions of people across continents, His work reached farther than most could ever imagine. Even people who had never heard his name relied on something he created every single day. His headquarters rose like a beacon of innovation, filled with engineers, designers, and thinkers who believed in the future Calder had envisioned. Meetings in those glass-walled rooms decided the direction of industries. A single signature from him could launch a new product or reshape a market. Yet for all that reach and control, none of it could help him now. As he lay there, recovering, the vast empire he had built felt strangely distant. It hummed along without him, proving that while his influence was enormous, it could never fill the quiet space left by one missing woman. Calder's wealth was beyond anything most people could truly understand. It wasn't just numbers on a screen or buildings in his name. It was the ability to change lives with a single decision, to fund entire hospitals, to move entire industries forward with one signed document. His resources placed him among the most powerful individuals in the world. Yet as he lay there, still feeling the echo of that terrible night, his fortune meant nothing. No amount of money could bring back the woman who had saved him. No account, no investment, no asset could tell him where she had gone. The irony was sharp. A man who could buy almost anything could not buy a name. That realization cut deep. For the first time in his life, Calder faced something that could not be solved with financial strength. And that made the absence of Arya feel even heavier, because she was something money had never been able to reach. Calder's influence reached far beyond boardrooms and balance sheets. A single statement from him could move markets, inspire entire teams, or bring attention to causes that had long been ignored. People listened when he spoke, not only because of his success, but because of the clarity and conviction behind his words. Leaders sought his advice. Innovators looked to him for direction. Even critics paid close attention, knowing that what Calder did today often shaped what the world would do tomorrow. His name carried weight, opening doors that remained closed to almost everyone else. Yet none of that power had helped him when his breath was failing inside that car, and none of it could tell him who the woman was that had stepped forward when he needed someone most. In that quiet hospital room, his influence felt suddenly limited, unable to touch the one question that mattered above all others. Throughout his career, Calder had grown used to people approaching him with expectations in their eyes. Some wanted funding for their ideas, others wanted access, influence, or a place within his vast network. Even those who claimed friendship often had quiet hopes tied to his success. It was rare for anyone to stand before him without an unspoken request. Meetings, dinners, and public events blurred together, each filled with polite smiles and carefully chosen words designed to gain something from him. Over time, Calder learned to read those looks, to sense when admiration was genuine and when it was simply another form of ambition. That constant pull on his attention made genuine connection difficult. It built invisible walls between him and the rest of the world. So when he thought about the woman who had saved his life and walked away without asking for anything, her absence felt even more striking. She had been different in a way nothing else in his life ever was. Arya's actions stood apart from everything Calder had ever known. She had stepped into danger without hesitation, given him the one thing he needed most, and then disappeared without leaving behind even a name. No request for thanks, no expectation of reward, no attempt to turn a life-saving moment into an opportunity. That simplicity unsettled him more than any demand ever could. It forced him to confront how rare it was for someone to act purely out of care. She hadn't known who he was. She hadn't known about his wealth or his reach. To her, he had simply been a man in need. In that truth lay something deeply powerful. Arya had seen him without the layers of status and success, and she had still chosen to help. That made her kindness feel genuine in a way Calder had almost forgotten was possible, and it left a quiet mark on his heart that refused to fade. The more Calder reflected on that night, the clearer it became that Arya was not like anyone else in his world. She hadn't paused to weigh the situation. She hadn't looked around to see who might be watching. She had simply acted, guided by something honest and deeply rooted within her. That kind of courage was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, and real. In a life filled with people who calculated every move, Her instinctive compassion stood out like a rare truth. Calder realized that he could not place her into any category he knew. She was neither admirer nor opportunist. She was simply someone who cared. That difference made her presence linger long after she was gone. It turned a fleeting encounter into a question that refused to rest. Who was this woman who could walk away from someone like him without hesitation? And why did the thought of her matter so much more than it ever should have? At first, Calder told himself he simply wanted to say thank you. But as days passed and no name or clue appeared, that simple wish grew into something far stronger. The image of Arya's face, calm yet determined, kept returning to him in quiet moments, refusing to fade into memory. He found himself asking about her whenever he could, pressing hospital staff for details, scanning reports, and replaying every second of that night in his mind. It wasn't driven by desire or longing yet. It was driven by an unanswered question that gnawed at him. Who had she been? Where had she gone? Why had she walked away so easily? That curiosity slowly became a pull he could not ignore. It filled the spaces between his thoughts, slipping into every pause. For a man used to having answers, not knowing her story felt like an unfinished chapter that demanded to be written, no matter how long it took. Calder was careful with his own thoughts. He knew how easily people could confuse gratitude for something deeper, so he questioned himself again and again. What he felt was not affection in the way stories often described it. He did not imagine holding her hand or walking beside her through life. Not yet. What drove him was something quieter and more honest. It was the need to understand why she had done what she did. In a world built on exchanges and rewards, her actions had no obvious reason. That mystery held his attention far more than beauty or charm ever could. He wanted to look her in the eyes and hear her story. He wanted to know what kind of person steps forward when others hesitate. Those questions, simple yet profound, were what kept him searching. Whatever would grow from that meeting would come later. For now, it was about truth, not romance, and that made his need to find her feel even more urgent. What truly drove Calder forward was a blend of wonder and appreciation that refused to fade. The mystery of Arya's choice stayed with him, not as a puzzle to solve, but as something deeply human to understand. Why would someone give so much and take nothing in return? That question followed him into meetings, into quiet evenings, into every space where his thoughts wandered. Alongside that curiosity lived a steady sense of thanks that could not be expressed with words alone. She had not just saved his life, she had reminded him that there were still people in the world who acted from care rather than gain. That knowledge stirred something inside him he had not felt in years. Together, those feelings formed a quiet force, guiding his focus back to her again and again. It was not driven by dreams of love, but by a need to honor the gift she had given him and to know the person behind it. As Calder lay there, still haunted by the absence of the woman who had saved him, one question rose above all the others. She had seen a stranger struggling for his life, stepped in without hesitation, and then vanished without asking for a single thing in return. No name, no thanks, no promise of recognition. That choice was rare. It stood in sharp contrast to a world where nearly every action comes with a hidden request. Arya had given something priceless and walked away as if it were nothing, and now Calder was left to wonder if anyone else would have done the same. So this story places that choice in your hands. If you had been in her place, if you had saved a life and learned later who that person truly was, would you have left just as quietly? Type yes if you believe you would have walked away. Type no if you think you would have stayed. Your answer says more than you might realize. Calder began his search in the only place that could still hold a trace of her: recorded memory. Hours of security video from the street outside the hospital were brought to him, each clip showing a different angle of the night that had nearly taken his life. He watched as cars moved through rain-washed streets, and people passed by without knowing how close a tragedy had come. Then, in one frame, he saw her. Arya appeared briefly on the screen, stepping away from the curb after helping him. Her figure was small against the glowing street, yet her presence filled his attention completely. He watched as she turned and walked away, never once looking back. Calder replayed the moment again and again, studying every step she took. It was strange to search for someone through images instead of words. Yet those few seconds of recorded time became the first fragile thread that tied him to the woman he refused to forget. Calder's next step led him deeper into the hospital's quiet halls, where files and digital charts held countless stories of pain and recovery. He requested every report from the night he was brought in, hoping that somewhere within those records, Arya had left a trace of herself. Nurses, emergency staff, and attending physicians all contributed what they could remember. Yet every document told the same simple truth. A woman had administered the medication that stabilized him. A woman had spoken calmly and stayed until medical teams took over. But where a name should have been, there was only blank space. That absence frustrated him more than any obstacle he had ever faced. Hospitals were built on careful record-keeping, yet this one person had slipped through without leaving even the smallest mark. Calder studied the charts late into the night, realizing that the woman he searched for had become a mystery, not because she was hidden, but because she had chosen to leave quietly, as if she had never been there at all. With no name to guide him, Calder turned to the clinics near the street where everything had happened. If Arya worked in healthcare, then somewhere her routine had to leave a mark. He reviewed shift schedules, visitor entries, and staff lists from small community centers in the area, searching for any sign of a woman who fit what little he knew. Most of the records were ordinary, filled with familiar names and daily tasks. Yet one pattern stood out. A few hours before the emergency, a young clinic worker had signed out at a nearby facility, ending her shift for the night. The timing was too close to ignore. Calder's pulse quickened as he focused on that single detail. It was not proof, but it was enough to keep him going. That small line of text, hidden among hundreds of others, became the next fragile link between him and the woman who had changed his life without ever telling him who she was. The trail led Calder to a modest corner of the city where the rush softened into something gentler. There, tucked between a tailor shop and a closed bookstore, stood a small bakery with a simple sign above the door. Even from the sidewalk, the scent of fresh bread drifted into the air, offering a comfort that felt oddly familiar. He stepped inside, taking in the warm glow of the lights and the quiet murmur of a few customers. This place felt far removed from the glass towers and crowded lobbies he knew so well. It felt like somewhere people came not to impress, but to rest. When he asked about the clinic worker who lived nearby, the woman behind the counter nodded and pointed toward a narrow staircase at the back. Calder's heart beat faster. He was close now, standing in a place that felt ordinary, yet held the first real promise of finding her. The narrow staircase creaked softly beneath Calder's steps as he climbed toward the apartment above the bakery. Each step carried the faint warmth rising from below, mixed with the comforting scent of baked bread. It was nothing like the sleek elevators and polished halls he was used to, yet something about this place felt strangely honest. At the top, a single door stood at the end of the short hallway, marked only by a small number that had begun to fade with time. A soft light glowed from beneath it, hinting that someone was home. Calder paused, his hand hovering just inches from the wood. This was it. Every question, every restless night, every memory of her calm face had led him here. The space felt intimate in a way he could not quite explain. Behind that door lived the woman who had saved him, and then vanished, and for the first time since waking in the hospital, Calder felt the weight of how much that meeting might change everything. Calder stood in the narrow hallway holding a small bouquet, the same white lilies he had chosen with quiet care. They were not extravagant, not meant to impress. He had picked them because they felt gentle, much like the woman he hoped was waiting behind the door. The paper around the stems was slightly crumpled from his grip, a sign of how tightly he held on to this small offering. In all his life, he had given gifts that came with expectations, contracts, and cameras. These flowers were different. They carried nothing but gratitude. He straightened his posture, taking a steady breath before raising his hand. The simple act of bringing flowers felt strangely meaningful. It was not about wealth or status. It was about showing up as one person to another, hoping that kindness would be enough to bridge the space between them. For the first time in a long while, Calder felt uncertain, yet that uncertainty felt honest. As Calder waited at the door, a quiet tension settled into his chest. This was not the familiar weight of responsibility he carried into meetings or public events. This was something far more fragile. His hands, which had signed documents worth millions, now felt unsteady as they held the flowers. There was no room here for the confident leader the world knew. Behind this door was someone who had seen him at his weakest, gasping for air, helpless and afraid. That memory humbled him in a way no failure ever had. He was not here to command or persuade. He was here to hope. Every second that passed made him more aware of how much he cared about this moment going right. In this narrow hallway, stripped of every title and advantage, Calder was just a man waiting to meet the person who had changed his life, unsure of what she might say when she opened the door. The door opened just a little at first, revealing Arya's face framed by soft light from inside the apartment. The moment her eyes fell on Calder, they widened in surprise. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. The quiet hallway seemed to hold its breath along with them. She had not expected to see him standing there, soaked slightly from the lingering rain, holding flowers like a hesitant guest. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of how he had found her. The last time she had seen him, he had been barely conscious, his life hanging by a thread. Now he stood upright and steady, looking at her with an expression that was not filled with power, but with something gentler. Arya stepped back instinctively, one hand resting against the doorframe. The past and present collided in her gaze, and for a moment all she could do was stare, caught between relief and uncertainty. Calder's voice came softly, as though he were afraid to disturb the moment. He thanked her, not with grand speeches or dramatic emotion, but with sincerity that reached far deeper. He told her how much that night had meant to him, how every breath he now took felt like a gift she had given. There was no trace of entitlement in his tone, only humility and quiet appreciation. Arya listened, her guarded expression slowly easing as she realized he was not there to demand anything. He wasn't even there to explain who he was. He was simply there to acknowledge what she had done. His eyes never left hers as he spoke. In them was a depth of gratitude that words alone could never fully express. For Calder, this moment was not about repaying a debt. It was about honoring a kindness that had changed everything and letting her know that it had never been forgotten. Arya chose a small cafe just a few streets from the bakery, a place that felt familiar and unpretentious. The windows were slightly fogged from the warmth inside, and the soft clink of cups created a gentle background rhythm. Calder followed her in, taking in the modest space with curious eyes. This was far from the sleek lounges he usually visited, yet it felt more inviting than any polished room he had ever known. They sat across from each other at a narrow wooden table, both holding warm mugs that sent thin streams of steam into the air. For a moment, neither spoke. It wasn't an awkward silence, just a pause as they both adjusted to the strange truth that their first real conversation was happening now, not during the chaos of that frightening night. Arya finally smiled, small and unsure, and thanked him for the flowers. Calder returned the smile, feeling a quiet sense of relief. This simple meeting, over ordinary coffee, felt like the first honest moment they had shared. It was not dramatic or overwhelming. It was calm, and somehow that made it far more meaningful. Their conversation began carefully, as if both were unsure how much to reveal. Calder spoke first, offering small details about his work and the city he called home. He avoided grand explanations, choosing instead to describe simple moments that had shaped him. Long nights solving problems, the quiet satisfaction of seeing an idea become something real. Arya listened with interest, her eyes attentive and kind. In return, she shared pieces of her own story, talking about the clinic and the people she helped every day. She described how rewarding it felt to ease someone's pain, even if only for a short while. There was pride in her voice, not the loud kind, but the steady kind that comes from knowing your work matters. As their words moved back and forth, a gentle trust began to form. Each story added a layer of understanding between them. They were no longer just two people connected by a single dramatic moment. They were slowly becoming two individuals learning who the other truly was. After finishing their coffee, Arya suggested a walk, and Calder agreed without hesitation. They stepped back onto the sidewalk where the city continued its gentle evening rhythm. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the distant sounds of traffic and conversation. They walked side by side, not too close, not too far apart, letting the quiet between them feel comfortable. Streetlights reflected off the damp pavement, creating soft patterns beneath their feet as they moved. Calder found himself slowing his pace to match hers, enjoying the simple act of being in step with someone else. Arya pointed out small details along the way: a favorite bookstore, a tiny park tucked between buildings, a corner where musicians sometimes played. These were not landmarks meant for tourists, but places that held personal meaning. Through her eyes, the city felt warmer, more alive. For Calder, this walk was a rare gift. There were no schedules, no meetings, no expectations, just two people sharing a moment, letting the world move around them as something gentle and unplanned began to take shape. As they walked, Arya began to describe the quiet pattern of her life. She spoke about early mornings above the bakery, waking to the smell of bread rising below her floorboards and the soft hum of ovens starting their work. She told him how she liked to sit by her small window with a cup of tea before heading to the clinic, using those few minutes to steady herself for whatever the day might bring. Her world was built from small, dependable pieces: regular patients who greeted her by name, neighbors who waved as she passed. Evenings spent reading or writing notes about the people she had helped. There was no rush for more, no hunger for attention. She had learned to value what was within reach, finding meaning in simple routines that made her feel grounded. Calder listened closely, surprised by how vivid her words felt. In his own life, days were filled with endless demands and shifting goals. Arya's description was different. It was steady, calm, and full of purpose. The more she shared, the more he sensed that her strength came not from having much, but from knowing exactly what mattered to her. After a brief pause, Arya's tone shifted, growing softer as she spoke about the worries she carried. She admitted that while her life was simple, it was not free of fear. She often wondered what would happen if she made the wrong choice or trusted the wrong person. Having seen people hurt in so many ways at the clinic, she knew how fragile even the strongest hearts could be. She talked about how easy it was for dreams to break when they were built on something unstable. That was why she held her independence so tightly. It made her feel safe, protected from disappointments she had watched others endure. She did not want to become someone who depended too much on things that might vanish. Calder heard the honesty beneath her words. These were not casual thoughts. They were the quiet truths she lived with every day. As she spoke, he realized that her bravery went far beyond that one night in the rain. It lived in the way she faced her own doubts, even when they tried to hold her back from something more. As Arya spoke, Calder chose his words with careful thought. There were parts of his life he kept quiet, not out of shame, but because he did not want them to shape how she saw him. He spoke of his work in simple terms, describing it as a role in building systems and helping businesses run more smoothly. He left out the size of his companies, the headlines, the influence that followed him everywhere. This was not a game to him. It was a way to protect the fragile space they were sharing. Calder wanted Arya to know him as a person, not as a figure tied to wealth and status. He had spent too much of his life watching conversations change the moment people learned who he was. Here, with her, he felt something rare. He could talk without being measured, without being weighed. The freedom in that silence was unexpected and deeply comforting. For the first time in years, he was not Calder Ashbourne, the powerful innovator. He was just a man walking beside a woman who had once saved his life. At some point during their walk, the weight of serious conversation eased and laughter found its way in. It started with something small, Arya teasing Calder about the way he held his coffee cup too carefully, as though it was something fragile. He smiled, surprised by how easily the sound came to him. Soon, they were trading stories that were less about meaning and more about simple amusement. Calder shared an awkward moment from a business trip where he had gotten lost in a city he barely knew. Arya responded with a tale about a patient who had mistaken her for someone else entirely. Their laughter echoed softly between them, warming the space they shared. In those moments, something shifted. The memory of the frightening night did not vanish, but it softened. They were no longer bound only by that dramatic connection. They were two people enjoying each other's company, finding comfort in humor and ease. The joy they shared felt genuine, and for Calder, it was more valuable than any polished event he had ever attended. As their walk continued, the space between them seemed to shrink without either of them noticing. Their steps fell into a natural rhythm, and their voices softened, as though they were sharing something meant only for the two of them. Calder found himself paying attention to small details, the way Arya's eyes lit up when she spoke about her patients, the gentle curve of her smile when she listened. Arya, in turn, felt a growing sense of ease around him. There was something about his calm presence that made her feel heard. He did not rush her words or fill the silence with noise. He let her thoughts settle, and that simple respect made her feel valued. This closeness did not arrive in a rush. It formed quietly, built from shared stories, laughter, and understanding. Neither of them named it, but both could feel it. The connection between them was no longer tied only to gratitude or curiosity. It was becoming something warmer, something that gently reached beyond the moment and into the spaces of their hearts. Neither Calder nor Arya had stepped into that day expecting anything more than a simple meeting. He had come to offer thanks. She had come out of courtesy and curiosity. Love had not been part of either plan. Yet, as the hours slipped by, something deeper quietly took root. It wasn't a sudden rush of emotion or a dramatic realization. It was the gentle awareness that being together felt right. Calder noticed how much he enjoyed hearing her voice, how the world seemed calmer when she was near. Arya felt the same, though she did not yet have the words to describe it. With him, she felt safe, understood, and strangely at peace. They did not speak of it, but their hearts began to move in the same direction. A connection born from chance and kindness was slowly becoming something far more personal. What had started with a single act of compassion was turning into a bond neither of them had expected, yet both were beginning to cherish without even realizing it. At first, Arya did not notice the change in herself. It arrived quietly, tucked between moments of laughter and shared walks. But slowly, a strange unease began to settle into her chest. When she stood beside Calder, she became more aware of the differences between their lives. He moved with a calm confidence that came from having choices. She moved with careful steps shaped by responsibility and routine. Small thoughts began to rise where none had existed before. Was she enough for someone like him? Did she truly belong in the same space as a man who seemed to carry the weight of entire industries on his shoulders? Even when he spoke gently and treated her with respect, she could not stop measuring herself against a world she had never known. She started to feel like a visitor in a story that was not written for her. His life felt wide and full of opportunity, while hers felt narrow and bound by familiar limits. That contrast made her feel small in ways she could not easily explain. It was not that Calder ever made her feel less. It was that she saw herself shrinking beside everything he represented. The more time they spent together, the stronger that sense became. Arya feared that she was standing in a moment that would eventually pass, no matter how beautiful it felt now. She had seen enough in her life to know that good things often came with an ending already waiting. And that knowledge, heavy and quiet, began to shape the way she saw their growing connection. Arya's doubt was not born from imagination alone. It came from years of watching how people from different worlds struggled to stay connected. At the clinic, she had seen relationships fall apart when expectations collided. She had listened to patients talk about partners who drifted away once life became complicated. Those stories stayed with her, shaping the way she viewed love and belonging. When she looked at Calder, she saw someone whose life was built on vast responsibility and endless demands. His days were filled with people who relied on him, decisions that affected thousands, and a future that stretched far beyond anything she could picture for herself. In her mind, that difference created a quiet gap between them. She told herself that love between people who lived such different lives was fragile. It might shine brightly at first, but eventually it would crack under the weight of reality. One person would have to give up too much, or feel too small, or become lost in someone else's world. That belief did not make her love him any less. It made her afraid of loving him too much. because if it was destined to fade, she would rather walk away now than stay long enough to feel the pain of watching it slip through her fingers. As Arya's feelings for Calder deepened, so did her fear. It was not loud or dramatic. It was the quiet kind that sits in the back of your thoughts, always reminding you of what you stand to lose. She had built her life carefully, brick by brick, making sure she could stand on her own no matter what happened around her. Falling for someone like him threatened that balance. Every time he smiled at her, every time they shared a quiet moment, she felt the risk growing. Love, she knew, had the power to make even the strongest person feel unsteady. If things went wrong, it would not just be a broken relationship, it would be a broken sense of safety. She imagined what it would feel like to give her heart to someone whose world might one day pull him away from her. That thought hurt more than she expected, even before anything had actually gone wrong. To Arya, the pain she might face felt more real than the happiness she was living. So she began to pull back in small ways, a little more silence here, a little more distance there. She told herself it was better to guard her heart now than to risk losing everything later. In trying to protect herself, she did not realize she was already standing at the edge of something she was afraid to face. The night Arya decided to leave was calm, almost too calm, as though the world had no idea what was about to be lost. She sat alone in her small apartment above the bakery, staring at the few belongings she had gathered into a single bag. Each item felt heavier than it should have, carrying memories of moments she was about to walk away from. Her heart was tight, but her mind was steady. She had convinced herself that this was the only way to protect what she had left. If she stayed, she would fall deeper. If she fell deeper, the pain would only grow when it ended. Leaving now felt like choosing a smaller wound over a larger one. She did not write a message. She did not leave a sign. Words would only make it harder, and she could not trust herself to be strong if she tried to explain. So she moved quietly, closing the door behind her with a soft click that sounded far too final. By the time morning came, her space was empty, her absence louder than anything she could have said. And Calder, unaware of what had happened, was about to wake up to a silence he never expected. Calder left his building early that morning with a quiet sense of anticipation. The city was just beginning to stir, and the air carried a gentle stillness that made everything feel possible. He had not heard from Arya since the night before, but that did not worry him at first. He assumed she was simply busy, caught up in her routine, as she often was. As he walked toward the bakery, his thoughts were filled with small plans. He imagined surprising her with breakfast, or suggesting another walk through the neighborhood she loved so much. There was comfort in the idea of seeing her again, in the steady presence she had become in his days. His steps quickened as he neared the familiar street. The bakery sign came into view, just as warm and welcoming as always. Calder smiled faintly, unaware that something had shifted while he slept. All he knew was that he was on his way to someone who had begun to matter more than he ever expected. He did not yet realize he was about to face the first true test of what that connection meant. Calder climbed the familiar stairs with an easy rhythm, expecting the soft glow of Arya's apartment at the top. When he reached her door, he knocked gently, waiting for the sound of her footsteps. Nothing came. He knocked again, a little louder this time, but the hallway remained quiet. A strange feeling settled into his chest as he tried the handle. It turned easily, opening onto a space that felt wrong in a way he could not yet explain. The room was dim and still, with no sign of movement. He stepped inside slowly, calling her name in a low voice, half expecting her to answer from somewhere out of sight. But there was no reply. The air felt empty, lacking the warmth he had grown used to when she was there. Even the light through the window seemed colder. Calder stood in the middle of the apartment, suddenly aware that something had changed, though he did not yet know what. The place that had once held her now felt strangely hollow, and that hollow space began to echo inside him. Calder's eyes moved slowly around the apartment, taking in details that felt suddenly unfamiliar. The small table by the window was bare, where Arya used to leave her books and notes. The hooks by the door no longer held her jacket. Even the shelf that once displayed a few simple keepsakes now stood nearly empty. It did not take long for him to understand what he was seeing. This was not someone stepping out for a short while. This was someone who had packed up her life and left. The realization struck quietly but deeply, settling into his chest with a weight that made it hard to breathe. He walked through the space, touching the edge of a chair, the frame of the bed, as though searching for something she might have forgotten. Each empty corner told the same story. Arya was gone, not just away for the day, but gone in a way that felt final. The room that had once reflected her presence now held only silence. And in that silence, Calder began to grasp that the woman he had come to care for had chosen to disappear without leaving a single word behind. At first, Calder searched for any other explanation. Maybe there had been an emergency. Maybe she had been called away suddenly. But the longer he stood there, the clearer the truth became. Arya had not left by accident. She had chosen to go. The absence of a note, the careful way her things had been gathered, all pointed to a quiet decision made long before he arrived. She had slipped out of his life with the same calm determination she had shown the night she saved him. That realization hurt more than he expected. He leaned against the wall, closing his eyes for a moment as the weight of it settled in. She had not been taken from him by circumstances. She had walked away. Whatever fear or doubt had driven her, it had been strong enough to pull her out of the connection they had begun to share. For Calder, this understanding was a sharp blow. He did not yet know why she had run, only that she had. And that unanswered question made the emptiness around him feel even deeper. What surprised Calder most was what he did not feel. There was no surge of anger, no rush of bitterness toward Arya for leaving. He did not clench his fists or curse the silence that surrounded him. Instead, a calm, aching stillness filled his chest, heavy but not violent. He had known enough about her to sense that she would not walk away without a reason. Whatever had driven her to leave must have been powerful, rooted in something deeper than carelessness. That understanding softened what could have been rage into something far more painful. Calder sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, letting the quiet wrap around him. He could have been furious that she had disappeared without a word, but all he could feel was concern. Was she safe? Was she hurting? Had he unknowingly become part of the fear that pushed her away? In that empty room, Calder realized that love, even in its early form, did not demand blame. It demanded patience. And so, instead of anger, he was left with a quiet hope that somewhere, Arya was all right, even if she was no longer here. As the reality of Arya's absence settled in, a deep ache spread through Calder's chest. It was not sharp or sudden. It was slow and heavy, like something precious slipping quietly out of reach. He had not realized how much space she had filled in his life until that space was suddenly empty. Every small memory returned to him with painful clarity. The way she smiled when she spoke about her work, the warmth in her voice during their walks, the gentle ease of being around her, all of it now felt distant, like something he had been allowed to hold only briefly. Calder pressed his hand against his chest, trying to steady himself. This kind of pain was unfamiliar. He had faced losses before, but they had always been tied to business or ambition. This was different. This was the loss of a person who had mattered to him in a way no one else ever had. In that moment, he understood that what they shared had not been small, and knowing that made letting go feel almost impossible. Calder remained seated on the edge of the bed, his hands resting loosely in his lap as the room settled around him. No phones rang. No voices filled the space. Even the distant sounds from the bakery below felt far away, muted by the weight of his thoughts. The stillness pressed gently against him, inviting him to feel everything he had been trying not to. He did not move for a long time. There was nowhere to go and nothing to fix. For once, he allowed himself to simply be present with the truth of what had happened. Arya was gone, and no amount of effort in that moment could change it. The simplicity of that fact was almost harder to accept than any complex problem he had ever faced. His eyes drifted across the room, landing on the empty spaces where her life had once been. Each blank corner spoke louder than any argument. In that silence, Calder felt both the depth of his loss and the quiet strength it took to sit with it. He stayed there, breathing slowly, letting the stillness hold him as the world outside continued without her. As Calder sat there, alone with his thoughts, one question pressed against his heart. Arya had chosen to leave. She had slipped away without a word, leaving behind only quiet rooms and unanswered feelings. Now he stood at a turning point, faced with a decision that would shape everything that came next. He could accept her choice and let the memory of her fade into the past. He could tell himself that some connections are only meant to last for a moment. Or he could hold on to the belief that what they shared was worth fighting for, even if the path ahead was uncertain. This is where you come in. Do you think Calder should let her go and respect her decision to disappear? Or should he keep searching for the woman who changed his life and his heart? If you believe he should keep looking, show your support by liking this story. Your choice might just mirror the one Calder is about to make. Calder did not remain in that empty apartment for long. The quiet had given him clarity rather than defeat. As painful as Arya's absence felt, something deeper than sadness began to rise within him. It was the steady belief that what they had shared had been real, and that real things did not vanish without a reason. He returned to his own place that evening and began making calls, not with urgency, but with purpose. He asked questions that went beyond simple location. He wanted to understand where someone like Arya might go when she needed distance from the world she had been living in. His search was not driven by pride or control. It was driven by care. Each piece of information he gathered reminded him of how little he truly knew about her, and how much he wanted to. That curiosity had grown into something far more personal now. He was not trying to bring her back by force. He simply needed to know if she was all right, if she had found peace somewhere beyond his reach. Calder knew the road ahead might be long, but he also knew that walking away without trying would leave a regret he could never escape. So he chose to keep going, guided by the quiet hope that somewhere Arya was still waiting to be found. Calder began where her heart had always been. Clinics. He reached out to small healthcare centers in nearby towns, asking quiet questions about recent hires and temporary staff. He did not mention her name because he still did not know it. Instead, he described a young woman with steady hands and a calm voice, someone who worked with care rather than attention. Most of the responses were ordinary. Many people passed through those places, and few left lasting impressions. Yet Calder kept going, reviewing records, speaking with administrators, and following any small hint that could point him forward. It was not glamorous work. It was slow and often frustrating, but he did not give up. With every call, he imagined Arya doing what she always did best, helping people quietly, without seeking recognition. That thought guided him more than any formal clue. Somewhere out there, she was still the same person who had saved him, still offering care to those who needed it. And Calder knew that if he could just find the right clinic, the one that felt different, he would be closer to her than ever before. Alongside the clinic inquiries, Calder began piecing together the path Arya might have taken when she left. He reviewed transit records, bus schedules, and ticket purchases tied to the area she had lived in. The goal was not to invade her privacy, but to understand the direction she had chosen. Patterns slowly emerged. A few travelers had departed the city around the same time she disappeared, heading toward quieter places by the sea. It was not proof, but it was enough to give him a direction to follow. Calder focused on those routes, narrowing his search with careful patience. Every line on a schedule felt like a possible thread connecting him back to her. Each destination held the chance that she might have chosen it as a place to start over. He imagined her sitting by a window, watching the city fade into distance, carrying only what she needed and the weight of her own fears. For Calder, following those records was like stepping into her choices. It brought him closer to understanding not just where she had gone, but why she might have needed to go there at all. Calder followed the trail beyond the city, moving through a string of quiet coastal towns where life slowed and the air felt lighter. These places were nothing like the crowded streets he knew. They were shaped by open skies, small clinics, and long roads that curved gently along the shore. It felt like the kind of place someone might choose when they wanted space to breathe and think. He visited each town with careful attention, walking through local streets, speaking with clinic staff, and learning the rhythms of communities that were built on familiarity rather than noise. In places like these, strangers stood out, and people remembered new faces. That gave him hope. With every stop, Calder imagined Arya choosing a place where she could disappear into something calm, where her past would not follow her so closely. The thought made sense. She had always valued simplicity, and these towns offered just that. Though the search was slow, it never felt empty. Each coastal road, each small clinic, felt like a step closer to her. Calder held on to that feeling, letting it guide him through every unfamiliar street, trusting that somewhere along this stretch of quiet shores he would finally find her. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that would have passed unnoticed if he had not been looking so carefully. Calder stepped into a modest clinic near the shoreline, its waiting area filled with soft voices and the gentle shuffle of patients moving between chairs. He asked a few polite questions at the front desk, keeping his tone calm, as he had learned to do throughout this search. Then he saw her. Arya stood near the far wall, speaking quietly with an elderly patient. Her posture was relaxed, her voice low and steady, just as he remembered. She wore the same simple confidence that had drawn him in before, moving through her work without any need for attention. For a moment, Calder could not breathe. It felt as though the long road he had been walking suddenly ended right there. She had not changed. Or perhaps she had only in the smallest ways. There was a new calm about her, a deeper stillness, but the heart of who she was remained. Calder stayed where he was, afraid that if he moved too quickly, the moment might slip away. After weeks of searching, of following small signs and distant places, he had finally found her, doing what she had always done best, helping people quietly, exactly as she always had. Arya finished helping the patient and turned slightly toward the waiting area, her mind already moving to the next task. That was when her gaze landed on Calder. For a fraction of a second, she thought her eyes were playing a trick on her. He stood there, just beyond the rows of chairs, his presence calm yet unmistakable. Her breath caught in her chest. The room around her seemed to soften, as though everything else had stepped back to give them space. She did not expect to see him there, in a place so far from the city and from the life she had left behind. The surprise was so strong that she forgot to move. Calder did not rush toward her. He stayed where he was, allowing the moment to unfold. Their eyes met across the quiet clinic, carrying all the unspoken things that had been waiting since the day she walked away. In that single glance lived relief, confusion, and a depth of feeling neither of them had been able to escape. Arya's hands trembled slightly as she held her clipboard. She knew, in that instant, that the past she had tried so hard to leave behind had found her again. The moment stretched between them, heavy with everything they had not said. Arya's shock gave way to something deeper, something she had been carrying since the night she left. Her eyes filled as she tried to speak, but no words came. All she could feel was the sudden return of every emotion she had tried so hard to bury. Calder watched her carefully, his own heart tightening as he saw her struggle. He did not step closer, giving her the space she seemed to need, even as he wanted to reach out. Tears slid down her cheeks, quiet and unstoppable, revealing how much she had been holding inside. This was not the kind of crying that came from fear alone. It was the release of everything she had lost by leaving, everything she had missed, and everything she still felt. The distance she had put between them fell away in those tears, leaving only the truth of how much she cared. For Calder, seeing her like this was both painful and reassuring. Painful because he knew she had been hurting. Reassuring because those tears meant that what they shared had been real, no matter how far she had gone to escape it. For a long moment, neither Calder nor Arya spoke. The clinic continued its gentle rhythm around them, but it felt distant, as though the world had narrowed to just the two of them standing there. In that quiet space, every memory returned at once. The rain, the car, the walk through the city, the laughter, the sudden goodbye. The weight of those shared moments pressed in on them, making it impossible to pretend nothing had happened. Arya wiped her tears, trying to steady herself, while Calder held her gaze, his expression filled with understanding rather than blame. They did not need words to know what the other was feeling. This silence was not empty. It was filled with everything they had carried apart and now had to face together. The fear that had driven her away, the longing that had driven him to search. All of it lived in that stillness between them. In that moment, both realized that the past had not faded with distance. It had been waiting for them, ready to be acknowledged. And standing there, neither of them could escape it any longer. Arya took a slow breath, her hands trembling slightly as she finally found her voice. The silence between them had become too heavy to hold any longer. She looked at Calder, not with distance, but with the raw honesty she had tried to escape. She told him the truth about why she had left. It wasn't anger. It wasn't lack of feeling. It was fear. A deep, quiet fear that grew stronger the closer she became to him. She admitted that being around him made her feel small, not because of anything he did, but because of everything he represented. His life felt wide and full of possibilities, while hers felt narrow and fragile by comparison. She had been afraid that she would always be the one trying to keep up, the one who did not quite belong. In her mind, she was just a woman from a simple life, someone who could be forgotten once the world he lived in demanded more of him. That thought made her feel temporary, like she was only meant to be part of his story for a short time. Arya confessed that she did not believe she was enough for someone like him, not strong enough, not important enough, not worthy enough to stand beside him when his life called him elsewhere. So she ran, not because she didn't care, but because she cared too much to risk being left behind. Her voice cracked as she spoke, and the truth finally settled between them, bare and unguarded. Calder listened to every word Arya spoke, letting her fears settle between them without interruption. When she finished, he stepped closer, his voice calm and steady. He told her that none of the things she had worried about had ever mattered to him. Not where she came from, not how much she had or didn't have. None of it had played any role in how he saw her. What had mattered was who she was in the moment he needed someone most. She had walked toward a stranger in danger and acted without hesitation. That was the woman he had come to know. That was the person he admired. Everything else was just background noise. He explained that he had never felt more seen than when she looked at him that night in the rain. In her eyes, he was not a powerful figure or a wealthy man. He was simply someone who needed help. That honesty had stayed with him far longer than any praise he'd ever received. Calder told her that he did not fall for her because of circumstance. He fell for her because of her courage, her kindness, and the quiet strength she carried into every room. Especially the woman who had saved his life without knowing his name. That was who she truly was to him. The air between them shifted as Calder's words settled into Arya's heart. Something that had been tight inside her for so long finally began to loosen. For the first time since she had run away, she felt seen not for what she feared she lacked, but for who she truly was. Tears returned to her eyes, but this time they carried a different feeling. They were no longer only about pain. They were about relief. She had spent so much time believing she was not enough that she had never allowed herself to hear someone say, with complete certainty, that she was. Calder reached out slowly, giving her the chance to step away if she wanted. She didn't. His hand found hers, and in that simple touch lived everything they had been afraid to speak. The fear that had driven her away lost its hold, replaced by the warmth of being understood. In that moment, something inside both of them changed. The past no longer felt like a shadow they had to avoid. It became part of a story they could face together. What had begun with distance and doubt was now filled with clarity and trust. And for the first time, Arya allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she did not have to run anymore. When Calder and Arya decided to move forward together, the first choice they made was not about where to go, but what to leave behind. Calder could have returned to the grand spaces he once called home, surrounded by glass walls, formal gatherings, and endless attention. That world waited for him, ready to welcome him back without question. But it no longer felt like the place where his heart belonged. He had seen how quiet moments with Arya filled him in ways success never had. He had felt the difference between being admired and being understood. The life he once led was built on achievement and recognition, yet it had always left him strangely empty. Arya never asked him to give any of it up. Still, he chose to step away from the noise on his own. He wanted a life where he could walk beside her without being pulled in 1,000 directions by people who saw him as something he wasn't in her eyes. Together, they turned from the shine of status and towards something far less impressive on the surface, yet far more meaningful beneath it. What they were choosing was not less, it was more of what truly mattered. Calder and Arya found a small place not far from the coast, where the pace of life was gentle and familiar faces greeted each morning. It was not impressive by any grand standard, but it felt warm in a way no towering building ever had. Sunlight reached their windows easily, and the air carried the soft sound of waves in the distance. Their days were built around ordinary things: grocery trips, walks along quiet streets, meals made together in a modest kitchen. Calder, who had once lived among constant motion, found a strange comfort in the predictability of it all. There was no pressure to perform, no image to maintain. He could simply be himself. Arya thrived in this life. It matched the rhythm she had always known. With Calder beside her, it felt even more complete. They did not need much to be happy. What they had was time, trust, and a shared space to grow. In choosing simplicity, they discovered something far greater than comfort. They found freedom. The freedom to live without pretending, without proving anything to anyone. Their new life was not measured by what it showed the world, but by how it made them feel each day. Their mornings began without alarms or rushing. Soft light filtered through their windows, touching the simple furniture and warming the room as the day slowly arrived. Calder would often wake before Arya, lying there quietly, listening to her steady breathing and feeling a sense of peace he had never known in his old life. There were no urgent calls waiting for him, no meetings pulling him away, just the quiet comfort of sharing space with someone who made him feel at home. Sometimes he would step outside to breathe in the fresh air, watching the sky shift from cool shades to warmer tones as the sun climbed higher. Arya would join him soon after, wrapped in a light sweater, her hair still loose from sleep. They rarely spoke much at first. They didn't need to. The simple act of being together in those early hours said everything. These mornings were not filled with excitement or plans. They were filled with something better: belonging. Each quiet start to the day reminded them that they had chosen this life not for what it offered the world, but for what it offered each other. Coffee became a small but meaningful part of their mornings. Calder learned how Arya liked hers, just a little warm milk and no sugar, and he took quiet pride in getting it right. The sound of the kettle and the rich scent filling their kitchen marked the true beginning of each day. They would sit together at a small table near the window, hands wrapped around their mugs, watching the world outside wake up. Some mornings they talked about simple plans. Other days they shared nothing more than comfortable silence. Both felt equally perfect. For Calder, this ritual was a reminder of how much his life had changed. Once, his mornings were filled with rushed schedules and endless decisions. Now, they were shaped by something gentle and personal. Arya often smiled as she sipped her coffee, grateful for the calm that surrounded them. It wasn't just the drink that made these moments special. It was the shared pause, the sense that no matter what the day held, they were starting it together. In those quiet cups of coffee, they found a simple kind of joy that no grand setting could ever replace. Laughter became the heartbeat of their new life. It showed up in small, unexpected moments, when Calder tried to help in the kitchen and made a mess, or when Arya teased him about his careful way of folding clothes. These were not grand jokes meant for an audience. They were soft, easy sounds that came from feeling truly at ease. In those moments, both of them forgot the fear and distance that had once stood between them. They laughed not because they were trying to be happy, but because happiness had quietly found them. Each shared smile was a reminder that their connection had grown from something real, not from circumstance or convenience. Calder often found himself watching Arya laugh, noticing how it lit up her face. It felt like proof that choosing this life had been the right decision. Arya, in turn, loved seeing the lightness in him, the way he no longer carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. Their home did not need anything fancy. It needed only that laughter, filling the rooms with warmth and reminding them both that joy had finally found a place to stay. Peace did not arrive in a single moment. It grew slowly, settling into their days the way gentle light settles into a room. For Calder, this calm felt new and almost surprising. His old life had been built on constant motion and endless demands. Here, the world felt quieter, as if it finally allowed him to breathe. Arya felt it too. The fears that once kept her awake at night began to loosen their grip. She no longer felt like she was standing on fragile ground. With Calder beside her, she felt supported in a way that did not take away her independence. Instead, it strengthened it. They found peace in the small things, the sound of waves in the distance, the steady rhythm of their routines, the comfort of knowing where they belonged. There was no need to prove anything to anyone. They were enough for each other, just as they were. This calm was not the absence of challenge. Life still moved forward with its usual surprises. But now, they faced it together, grounded by trust and care. In that shared stillness, Calder and Arya discovered a kind of peace that neither of them had ever known before, one that did not depend on success or approval, only on the quiet truth of being together. What Calder and Arya were building was not something you could measure or display. It did not exist in numbers or grand plans. It lived in the way they cared for each other, in the trust that had grown from honesty and patience. Every day added another small layer to a life that felt strong because it was shared. They made choices together, from the simplest decisions to the ones that shaped their future. Arya continued her work at the clinic, while Calder found ways to use his skills without returning to the life he had left behind. They supported each other's dreams without trying to change them. In time, their home became a place where both of them felt fully themselves. There was no need to hide fears or pretend to be more than they were. What they had was built on respect, kindness, and a deep understanding of each other's past. This was not a story about grand romance or perfect endings. It was about two people who had chosen to stay when running felt easier. And in doing so, they created something far more lasting than anything either of them had ever owned. Calder and Arya's journey was never truly about wealth, fame, or the distance between their worlds. Those things only formed the surface of their story. Beneath it all was a much simpler truth that many people spend their whole lives trying to understand. Love does not grow from what someone owns or the position they hold. It grows from the courage to stay when leaving would feel safer. Arya ran because she was afraid. She believed that loving someone from a different world would only lead to heartbreak. Calder stayed because he understood something she could not see yet. Real connection does not come from comfort. It comes from choosing someone, even when fear tells you to walk away. This is the lesson their story leaves behind. You can have everything the world considers valuable and still feel alone. You can have very little and still hold something priceless in your heart. What matters is not how impressive your life looks, but who stands beside you when things become uncertain. Arya was brave when she stepped toward a stranger in danger. Calder was brave when he stepped toward a woman who had left him behind. In both moments, they chose care over fear. That choice is what gave their story meaning. So often, people run from love because it makes them feel vulnerable. But vulnerability is where real connection lives. It is where two people see each other not for what they can offer, but for who they are. Calder and Arya did not find happiness by chasing perfection. They found it by choosing each other again and again, even when doubt made it difficult. That is the heart of their story. Not the rescue, not the search, not even the reunion. The heart of it is the simple, powerful act of staying. When Arya stepped toward Calder on that rainy night, she saved more than his breath. She reminded him that kindness still existed in a world that often asked for something in return. In that moment, she saw a man who needed help and chose to give it without hesitation. That act did not just keep him alive, it gave him a new way to see the world and his place within it. Later, when Calder refused to let her disappear, he saved her in a different way. Arya had been living with the quiet weight of loneliness, believing that she did not belong in a life larger than her own. By searching for her, by standing before her and telling her the truth about how he saw her, Calder showed her that she was not invisible, not replaceable, and not alone. Their story is not only about survival, it is about how two people can bring light into each other's lives when everything feels uncertain. Arya gave Calder a future he would never have had without her. Calder gave Arya a sense of belonging she never believed she deserved. Each of them rescued the other, not through dramatic gestures, but through presence and care. One saved a body, the other saved a heart. And together, those two forms of rescue created something that neither of them could have found on their own. That is why their story stays with us, because at its core, it is not about chance or fortune. It is about how deeply one person can change another simply by choosing not to walk away. If this story stayed with you, it's because somewhere within it, you saw a piece of your own life. Maybe you recognized Arya's fear of not being enough. Maybe you felt Calder's quiet longing to hold on to something real in a world that often feels empty. Stories like this remind us that love, courage, and connection are not rare. They are waiting for us when we choose not to turn away. If you believe in stories that speak to the heart, make sure you subscribe to Billionaire Tales by Owen so you never miss another journey like this. Every story here is meant to leave you with something more than entertainment. They are meant to leave you with meaning. Take a moment to like this story if it moved you in any way. That simple action helps more people discover stories that remind them of what truly matters. And now, I want to hear from you. What part of Calder and Arya's story touched you the most? Was it the moment she saved him? The way he searched for her? Or the truth they finally shared? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Your voice adds to the story. If you know someone who needs to hear this message, share this video with them. You never know whose life a story might change. Thank you for being here and for believing in love that chooses to stay.